good evening, and welcome. Good evening. I'm Patricia Mcdonald, Director of the Wichita Art Museum. Glad you're here in such a crazy busy season at the Art Museum, and thank you for your indulgence, your patience, your forgiveness for all the construction havoc that we have going on. And yet, interestingly, despite the construction, our current Preston Singletary exhibition is really drawing people to us. They will make it all the way to our back door to be able to come. So in the first 2 weeks when that exhibition was open, we had over 700 people more in that 2-week period this year than we did last year. So I'm really proud of what's happening with that show. And I think significantly that's attendance that's happening through word of mouth. So we've got construction havoc, we've got larger crowds. It's a busy time at the Art Museum. And say that again?
Really good exhibit.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you. People are saying such positive things. Thank you. I've been eager for this program for quite some time. We do, I think, a nice series on photography, or pay really attention to this medium and art form in our exhibitions and in our activities. And I'm very proud for the museum that this is our second Pete Armstrong photography lecture. So Pete, sadly, is no longer with us. He passed away a number of years ago, but he was quite a significant Wichitan, and he had a real passion for photography. And so his family determined that an appropriate way to honor him, and their family patriarch, was to endow an annual talk on some subject in photography. So 3 things in particular made Pete Armstrong important to photography in Wichita, or that he was really devoted to photography at any rate. He was himself a talented photographer. He was a photographic officer in the Second World War, and then he continued that as a passion throughout his life. He just so happened to grow up as a childhood friend of W. Gene Smith, a childhood friend who went on to world fame, worked for Life magazine, and is really one of the prominent photographers of the 20th century. And because of that relationship with Gene Smith, Pete Armstrong and his family and his wonderful wife Mickey were part of the band of people at Wichita State University who worked for fundraising. The family both worked with the campaign, but gave generously to bring the Gordon Parks papers to Wichita State University. So 3 reasons why. In particular, we remember Pete and his connection to photography. After serving in World War II, he returned to Wichita. He joined the company McCormick Armstrong. He rose through the ranks, ultimately was chairman of that highly successful family business. Sadly, his wife Mickey was ill this week, and she's not with us, but her daughter Carolyn Verdon is here in the audience. So thanks to the family member. So what a wonderful way to honor a wonderful man. And I'm quite honored that we were able to attract such a distinguished speaker this evening in Elizabeth Siegel. She has a great job. I'm envious of this job. I'd like to quit my job to have her job. She's the curator of photography at the Art Institute of Chicago. She started on her career path with an undergraduate degree from Yale, and also a PhD from the University of Chicago. She started at the Art Institute in 1997, and across the years there, she's grown in both experience and responsibility. She's delved into very fascinating corners of the history of photography, and she has projects and publications on such things as 19th century American photographic albums, so family albums, Victorian era photo collages, and the intersection of photography and folk art. She studied and published on the European Moholy-Nagy, who actually emigrated to the United States. He was a pioneer who experimented with techniques to really pioneering methods of photography to create an abstracted photography. She studied and published on Ralph Eugene Meatyard, a surrealist-inspired photographer, and she organized a collection of photography at the Art Institute, and with an exhibition that caught our eye last year. A couple in Chicago shared an amazing photography collection with her museum, modern photography, and Liz organized a presentation of that collection of work that then asked this question: what are the ingredients that make a photograph not just a photograph, but an icon? And that was perplexing and compelling, and we thought, I wanted to understand how she might answer that question, and I thought many of us in Wichita would as well. So please help me to welcome Liz both to Wichita, this is her first time here, and to the podium for this talk. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. There are seats if people are standing and want to sit. They asked me to talk for about an hour, so get comfortable. All right. So first of all, thank you, Patricia. Thanks for inviting me here to speak. It's already been such a warm welcome coming here. I'm definitely coming back once the renovations are done. I want to thank the family of Pete Armstrong. I'm very sorry not to be able to meet Mickey, but I've been learning about his great generosity and love of photography, and his connection with Gene Smith, who will play only a very small role, but played a big role in the history of photography, and Gordon Parks, who will play a much larger role in my talk tonight. But I am honored to be here delivering a lecture named for such a generous supporter of the museum and of photography. All right, so as Patricia was saying, she invited me here to speak with you tonight because she had heard about this exhibition that I mounted at the Art Institute, which showed the holdings of one particular Chicago area collection and looked at it from the point of view of photographic icons. So that was the genesis of my thinking. And tonight you'll see some examples from that collection. But this lecture was also a great opportunity for me to move beyond just that one collection and take a broader look at the field, particularly in America. So how it was formed in the domain of art, and how it started claiming for itself a canon of key images. So I should tell you, I actually typically run from this kind of discussion. In my own scholarship, I prefer to unearth the stories that have not yet been told, the kinds of photographs that we have overlooked, the unacknowledged makers who influenced the field. I'm drawn instead to practices of teaching, of looking, of collecting, of exhibiting. So I tend to not take on the big names in the field and produce scholarship about lone geniuses. When I exhibited Alfred Stieglitz last, it was to see how he and his circle revived artists from the 19th century. When I've shown Walker Evans, it was up against the renewed interest in the revival of folk art in 1930s America. And when I wrote about Harry Callahan and Aaron Siskind, it was to look at them as teachers in a new kind of photographic pedagogy. And indeed, the word masterpiece itself connotes a meaning and an approach largely white and predominantly male that is becoming increasingly passé in all fields. So why was I interested? Why icons then? Why the canon? Well, it turns out that looking at photography through the lens of iconic images offers up some really fascinating insights about the field. For one thing, such images never exist in a vacuum. You don't have a photographer go out on a shoot or go into the studio, make an earth-shattering image, and say, well, that's done. I've just created an icon. No, it needs to be shared. It needs to be circulated, put into some context. It needs to be reproduced. It often needs a story around it. And it has to be given an imprimatur by figures of authority, such as curators and editors, and it needs structures of authority, such as museums, journals, and books. Now, as art history goes, photography is a baby. It was first announced to the world in 1839, centuries after Giorgio Vasari wrote his Lives of the Artists. The earliest histories of photography were largely technological, that is to say, a history of techniques, or geographical, a much disputed history of who and which country discovered it first. And it was not until the 20th century that such structures of authority began to take deep hold in the field and began to develop a canon of makers and works that would define what artistic achievement in photography might look like on its own terms. So what I want to do with you here tonight is press a little bit on this notion of the icon in photography. So why were certain pictures anointed as key to an emerging canon? How did such an anointing take shape? And what can this tell us about photography and the practice of canon formation, both historically and today? And then I want to show you a few examples. We'll go kind of deep. And together we can look at the key factors in the production of iconic work, the recipe for a canon in the young history of photography, so to speak. So we all know that certain works of art have become iconic through the very agency of photographs. So for a fixed work of art to be viewed by large numbers of people who might not be able to make their way to, say, the Louvre, photography offered up seemingly faithful reproduction and potentially limitless circulation. And already in the 19th century, it was starting to be photographed and circulated. Now, on my tours at the Art Institute of this show, I would give this example, and I would say, okay, how many of you know what the Mona Lisa looks like? And everybody would raise their hand, and I would say, okay, but now, how many of you have actually been to the Louvre? Thinking I would prove that they all knew about this through photography. But unfortunately, everybody on my tours at the Art Institute raised their hand that they had all been to the Louvre. And so I'm not going to repeat that here because I'm imagining it'll be the same number of hands here. But photography didn't just help paintings gain notoriety. Actually, here, this is one of the things that I'm sure you're used to seeing, and this is, only a piece of it. So photographs themselves also became iconic, also through circulation. But these often became widely known for something beyond just the photograph itself. So for example, a famous figure or a historic event. So if I describe to you an image of Marilyn Monroe in a white halter dress, standing atop a grate with her dress blowing up, I'm pretty sure you have that picture in your heads, right? Or if I say Muhammad Ali delivering the knockout punch to Sonny Liston, you probably got that, yeah? If I refer to the explosion of the Hindenburg, it's likely that the collective consciousness of this room is imagining this historic photograph. And if I say Kent State shooting, it's likely that that's the image that comes to mind, right? So I could go on like this, but you get the idea. All of these photographs, they're terrific shots, well composed, demonstrating quick reflexes. They assume something transparent about photography, that it exists to show us something beyond itself, that it's the subject that makes the picture. Okay, so what about photographs that become iconic simply for being photographs? That become known for using the language of photography to make a statement about photography as art, not of something else. So I want to argue that there are two main ingredients in this recipe. The first is a set of key figures and structures that began defining the terms of art photography. Tonight I want to focus in on America in the middle of the 20th century, which is a key period in the formation of a photographic canon. So this is the moment when museums begin collecting photographs and mounting solo exhibitions of photographers' works, notably the Museum of Modern Art in New York with its enormously influential program, and photo-illustrated magazines such as Life and Look circulated on a vast scale, shifting storytelling from words to pictures. New photographic books began to be published, largely in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, but followed by a post-war boom here at home. And curators and editors, new voices of authority, proclaimed particular images as essential to the history of photographic achievement. The second main ingredient for photography to enter the art world on its own terms, I would argue, is a new aesthetic standard for modernism. Artists and critics began to embrace so-called straight photography, honest, unmanipulated, and sharply focused images that reminded viewers of the camera's mechanical origins. So such photographs emphasized documentary clarity, orderly compositions, graphic form. They illuminated beauty in everyday objects, and they made viewers see familiar experiences in novel ways. So I want to start with an image, actually not this one, this is just an image of somebody. This is an image of Alfred Stieglitz, with an image that became iconic through the sheer force of will of its maker, Alfred Stieglitz. The renowned photographer, gallerist, editor, and publisher, and now occasionally better known as the husband of Georgia O'Keeffe, was a tremendous force in American photography for decades, from the end of the 19th century up through his death in 1946. He advocated tirelessly for photography as a fine art, first by making painterly, pictorialist images, and then switching to and promoting straight photography. And in his later years, he would hold court in his galleries, telling stories and handing down opinions about art and life. And he would often tell the story of his most acclaimed photograph, and his account was published in 1942 for the magazine Twice a Year in an article titled, "How the Steerage Happened." Now, Stieglitz's own telling has shaped the narrative of that photograph ever since. It's now a staple of art history courses, and an entire book has been devoted to the study of just this single image. So let me tell you his side of the story. In the spring of 1907, Stieglitz was traveling by steamer from New York to Europe, not the other way around. A lot of people think these are immigrants coming into the country, for a long summer trip with his wife and daughter. He felt suffocated by the bourgeois company of the first-class cabins. So he went out onto the decks to seek out new scenery, and he looked down at the level of the third-class passengers. And he described later for this article what he saw then, and it's worth a little bit of a lengthy quote so you can hear his own words. So now I'm quoting Stieglitz. "A round straw hat, the funnel leading out, the stairway leaning right, the white drawbridge with its railings made of circular chains, white suspenders crossing on the back of a man in the steerage below, round shapes of iron machinery, a mast cutting into the sky making a triangular shape. I stood spellbound for a while, looking and looking. Could I photograph what I felt? Looking and still looking? I saw shapes related to each other. I saw a picture of shapes, and underlying that, the feeling I had about life." So he races back to his cabin, gets his Graflex camera, hoping against hope that the scene is still there when he returns. It is, but he has only one plate left. Can he get it? He takes the picture, breathless. He says, quote, "It would be a picture based on related shapes and on the deepest human feeling, a step in my own evolution, a spontaneous discovery." When he's finally able to develop his plate in Paris, Stieglitz is thrilled. It is everything he thought it would be. In his account, he relates what happens next. He shows it to a trusted photographer friend from his pictorialist days, who doesn't quite understand it. So demoralized, Stieglitz puts it away. Later, however, in 1910, just a few years later, he shows it to some painter friends steeped in the avant-garde, and they recognize it for what Stieglitz wants it to be, a new kind of expression, a modern photographic vision. He's further vindicated when Picasso reportedly says, "This photographer is working in the same spirit as I am." Reinvigorated, Stieglitz publishes it in his journal, Camera Work, in 1911, and he continues to publish it and exhibit it in a variety of venues. So here's just one example, and you can see this avant-garde context he puts for it. He later produces a special issue of his magazine, 291, and prints 500 photogravures on fancy Japanese paper. But this does not catch on with the general public, and most of them end up, as he wryly relates in his account, going to the rag picker. Okay, so what are we to make of this story? In fact, recent scholarship has called into question nearly every detail of his account. What day it was, the weather, his location on the ship, even this sense of spontaneous discovery, the sense of something entirely new and almost divine, has been disproved. He had rehearsed this picture with similar ones on different voyages. But the details clearly don't matter. This story, crafted and shaped by Stieglitz over the following 35 years after the photograph was made, takes on the dimensions and patina of myth. The more interesting question may be why, if a photograph could be autonomous and self-sufficient, born of this new combination of formal rigor and emotion, does it require so much juxtaposition with text? Well, the narrative is a crucial component of the production of this photographic icon, and Stieglitz controlled the narrative. And in his story, we learn a few key things: that he could recognize and construct a work of art out of daily life, that this visual and mental recognition is matched by a certain physical vigor. He runs and gets the camera, he makes the exposure, that the old guard did not understand it, but a new generation of artists did, including no less than Picasso, and that the bourgeois public, whose opinions he disdained anyway, might never appreciate it. And of course, there is his key modernist claim that shapes can express a feeling the artist has about life. And much has been written about the fact that this reduction of people to shapes elides all sorts of contemporaneous discussion about class, about ethnicity, about immigration. And I'm afraid I have to leave that for a different lecture. But for now, let me just say that this discussion of form was entirely new for photography. Now, importantly, Stieglitz not only shaped the narrative with words, but with reproduction, with photography itself. He published the steerage in his own journals and allowed it to be published in select other publications. He also exhibited it in his own galleries. And sometime in the 1920s or 1930s, he reprinted it. The later print was not the enlarged photogravure on Japanese paper, and I really wish you could see these objects in person. You might have to take my word for it. It's a softer, more atmospheric print, but rather a smaller gelatin silver contact print with sharper focus and higher contrast. This newer print, he later said, felt much more in the spirit of his recent work, giving it a history that is inflected with the new and the modern. It was precedent like that of Stieglitz that allowed Edward Weston to embrace a whole new approach to photographic form. The California-based photographer had also begun working in a pictorialist style, but soon adopted the tenets of straight photography. And by the early 1930s, he had found a like-minded group of photographers in the Bay Area, including Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham, Willard Van Dyke, and others. They banded together to form a new movement that they called Group F64, named after the smallest aperture on a photographic lens, the one that would give the most overall sharpness and focus. And they exhibited their work in November 1932 at the de Young Museum in San Francisco, And like any self-respecting artistic movement, they published a manifesto that described their aims toward pure photography, which they defined as possessing no qualities of technique, composition, or idea derivative of any other art form. The members of Group F64, they went on, believe that photography as an art form must develop along lines defined by the actualities and limitations of the photographic medium, and must always remain independent of ideological conventions of art and aesthetics that are reminiscent of a period and culture antedating the growth of the medium itself. That is to say, translation, the work should look as if it were made by a machine, not a paintbrush, taking full advantage of the sharp focus and the complete tonal range that camera and film offered. Now, shortly before Group F64 was formed, Weston had begun making a series of photographs that would change the artistic possibilities for photography. He had made still life photographs while he was in Mexico in the 1920s. And when he comes back to California, he started experimenting with photographing peppers. And he had a burst of activity around 1929, 1930. He controlled the lighting to describe their curved, reflective surfaces, marveled at their, quote, marvelous convolutions, and likened them to carved obsidian. One time, however, and he relates this in his daybooks, tragedy struck when his son Brett ate 2 of them before he could photograph them. In August of 1930, he wrote in his daybooks, quote, "It is classic, completely satisfying, a pepper, but more than a pepper. Abstract in that it is completely outside subject matter. It has no psychological attributes, no human emotions are aroused. This new pepper takes one beyond the world we know in the conscious mind." And by 1931, he had produced some 50 negatives, but this one, number 30, became one of his favorites and his most famous. Weston exhibited his photographs almost immediately, which is actually kind of rare at the time, at the Delphic Studios in New York in 1930. And the New York Times wrote a lengthy review that was titled, "Lowly Things That Yield Strange, Stark Beauty." In it, Frances McMullen noted how Weston transformed the most humble of subjects into something much more elevated. And she also recognized this as a key tenet of modernism, the ability of art to ennoble the everyday. "With all the ardor of the modernist," she wrote, "Mr. Weston has joined in the search that animates all modern art, the quest for significant form. But he has gone about it in a way utterly different from the painter, the sculptor, the sketcher. They look within, searching the soul for conceptions to transfer to canvas or marble. He looks about him, finding within easy reach abundant exemplifications of the quality they grope for." Weston's uncompromising approach to form resulted in sculptural, even erotic images, although this latter quality was something that he was not that keen to promote. And he lamented how viewers saw the most prurient forms in works that for him existed on a higher plane. Weston's peppers would become central to future selections and displays of his work, which were promoted by well-placed curators, editors, and publishers on both coasts. So also in California, but with a completely different focus for her camera, was Dorothea Lange. And when I mention iconic images by Dorothea Lange, I imagine you are all expecting me to discuss this, Migrant Mother, perhaps the most famous documentary photograph of the 20th century. Playing on age-old tropes of the Virgin and Child, this picture became the face of the Depression and has been reproduced more than I could possibly count. But if that is the case, I'm really sorry to disappoint you. Instead, I want to talk about a picture she made a few years earlier, this one. The picture that changed the terms for her photographically, that got her out of the studio and into the street. White Angel Breadline. So Lange had been working as a portraitist in San Francisco, photographing wealthy patrons, while a growing number of unemployed men passed by her window every day. One day she followed them to where a woman called the White Angel had organized food distribution, taking along her brother Martin for protection because she had no idea how these down-and-out men might react to her camera. She made only 3 exposures that day. One of them, the throng of food seekers and this man, tin cup in hand, turned away from the rest of the crowd. In a 1963 interview, she discussed taking this particular photograph and said, "I can only say I knew I was looking at something. You know, there are moments such as these when time stands still and all you do is hold your breath and hope it will wait for you. And you just hope that you will have enough time to get it organized in a fraction of a second on that tiny piece of sensitive film. Sometimes you have an inner sense that you have encompassed the things generally. You know then that you are not taking anything from anyone, their privacy, their dignity, their wholeness." This photograph works because of a combination of that very empathy, religious iconography, and photographic form. The lone man leans against a wooden barrier like a supplicant at the altar, a perhaps instinctive reference to a history of painting that would serve Lange well when she made Migrant Mother. But she also manages a feat of visually combining the socioeconomic context with the story of the individual. So we see the effect of the Depression in the largely faceless crowd, a sea of hats, each representing an unemployed and hungry man. Here is a story of a collapse of society on a national scale. At the same time, however, she fixes her camera on the man with the tin cup, with his mouth set in the tight line, reminding us that this collapse affects individuals, each with his or her own history. With its sensitivity to both hardship and dignity, this photograph soon came to represent the human impact of the Great Depression. White Angel Breadline gained approval from some of the most prominent gatekeepers in America. In 1935, on the strength of this and other photographs that Lange had started making out in the street, the government hired her to document Americans hardest hit by the Depression. By 1940, this photograph had been published in the New York Times in a mosaic of images called American Faces that were selected from a larger group of images being featured in U.S. Camera Annual. And that same year, it entered the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art as a gift from a San Francisco collector who supported her work at a time when very few people collected photographs as art. Edward Steichen included this photograph in his 1949 exhibition, The Exact Instant, 100 Years of News Photography. But perhaps most important, Lange always listed this picture as among her favorites, a reminder that her talents were best put to use, documenting the lives of everyday people. All right, now I'm going to assume you're all familiar with Gordon Parks here in Wichita, the legendary photographer, writer, musician, and filmmaker. In 1942, Parks was a young photographer who had just come to Washington, D.C. to work with Roy Stryker, the head of the historical section of the Farm Security Administration. Now, that agency had been founded under FDR's New Deal to assist farmers during the Depression, and the historic section was founded to document and promote those activities with photographs. And the photographers that Stryker hired, including Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Ben Shahn, Arthur Rothstein, Marion Post Walcott, among others, helped create a national image bank of sorts, reflecting America's new reality back to its citizens. Parks joined this agency late in its life and was the FSA's first and only African-American photographer. Parks had come to Washington on a Julius Rosenwald Fellowship, eager and enthusiastic to be in the nation's capital, the seat of democracy, as he later recalled. Now, Stryker knew the realities of Washington much better than Parks, and he sent him out to tour the city, get a sandwich, catch a show, and get to know the place. Go without your camera, he suggested, and instead write about what you see to make a plan for the photographs. But when Parks went around, he was refused service in the restaurants and theaters that he tried to patronize. Furious, he decided he wanted to document the city's segregation and discrimination. Stryker sent him to look at the FSA files, at the work of his fellow agency photographers and learn how to make a single image, how to string them together in a photo essay. And he also introduced him to Ella Watson, an African-American woman who cleaned the FSA offices. So Parks and Watson began an extended collaboration that took them across Watson's home, church, and work, her family, friends, and community. And although he made several photographs of her, really quite a long collaboration, and these are all on deposit with the FSA archives at the Library of Congress, one particular image stood out. Officially titled Government Charwoman, Washington, D.C., it features Watson in a faded polka dot dress with 2 buttons missing, a broom on one side and a mop on the other, posed in front of the American flag, looking out with an even but possibly challenging expression. When Roy Stryker saw the image, according to Parks, he nearly died. "You've got the right idea, but you're going to get us all fired," he said. The FSA had already riled some Southern conservatives for the images they had published of African Americans in the South. So Stryker just files this picture away, and it was not published for several decades. So what did Stryker see in the photograph that made him so afraid? And what have we, in the decades since, seen that makes nearly every account of this image include the word iconic? Well, for one, it is an intensely legible image, by which I mean that you can read its intent quickly, and that most viewers would agree that it comprises, as Parks himself said, an indictment of America. The American flag is one of the most potent symbols we can marshal in any depiction of American society, and here it stands as a backdrop of promise and hope against the distinctly limited realities of a middle-aged black cleaning woman in 1942 Washington. But Parks did not make this photograph on a whim or in a vacuum. In fact, it's an amalgam of and an homage to many other images he would have been aware of in both popular and fine art. So there's the visual context of a long history of national allegorical images featuring women holding various implements, draped in or against the flag. Before Uncle Sam, the goddess of liberty, Columbia, was a female personification of America, and her image circulated widely as on this World War I poster. That very summer, as the scholar Michael Lobel has pointed out, the cover of Vogue featured a woman in a classically styled white dress, striding forth between 2 flags billowing in the wind. It was 1942, and America was at war. Patriotic references with the American flag were commonplace in the national visual landscape. But now the personification of America is not a young white woman, but a middle-aged black woman, her toga-like garments replaced by a simple frock. And we also need to remember that this wartime context came in the middle of a great national debate about the segregated military. African-American activists, organizations, and publications advocated for allowing black men to fight, arguing that they could not combat Hitler's army with legions of janitors and charwomen, armed only, quote, with a mop and a broom. This pointed political commentary then was remarkably specific to its era. Its timeliness would be suppressed in the file until much later, when it would come to be appreciated for its timelessness. So some 3 decades later, Parks recalled, he finally saw the photograph in print on the front page of the Washington Post. FSA negatives were intentionally kept on file and made available to writers and editors and citizens who wanted to publish them. And someone had discovered this one at the bottom of the file where Stryker had carefully placed it. The power of this image was quickly recognized, and this photograph's impact as a singular expression has been accepted ever since, as it has been reproduced in books, exhibitions, magazines, online. But now it had a new name, American Gothic. Parks surely knew the painting, which he would have seen at the Art Institute when he lived in Chicago. In a 1964 oral history, he said he stood Ella Watson up, quote, with the American flag hanging down Grant Wood style, and did this marvelous portrait. Now, the painting had its own notoriety. It was exhibited at the Art Institute in 1930, 1 year after the stock market crash. and it seemed to symbolize American values, rural austerity, and can-do perseverance. It had taken third prize, and the museum purchased it for the collection. Nobody now remembers who took first prize. But immediately it became controversial. East Coast critics said it represented rural backwardness, while Iowa housewives started a letter-writing campaign complaining that they were misrepresented and were actually much more modern than the painting indicated. This collision of offended housewives and the condescending elites thrust the painting into public view, where it was widely reproduced, and Wood, a great self-promoter, capitalized on the fame. And incidentally, earlier today, I happened to see David Bradley's American Indian Gothic, which is on view in the galleries here. I don't know if you all have seen this. So as you know, the fame of this painting continues to inspire both parody and homage. So here you have a potent combination of forces. A photograph designed to be in conversation with American symbols and politics, that engages with key images from high and popular culture, yet one whose reception is delayed until an opportune time for a reevaluation, an era of civil rights and Black power. Of course, this recipe only works if the photographer is sensitive and the photograph is well considered and composed. With the portrait of Ella Watson, one senses that she is a real person as much as a symbol of American inequality. And one also senses that Parks's attitude is much more complex than a simple indictment of American society. With this picture, you feel anger, sympathy, and perhaps even hope that the symbols will ultimately live up to their potential. Now, in the 1960s, when this work was being rediscovered, an entirely different kind of documentary image began to take hold, one that was exemplified by Garry Winogrand and his approach to street photography. Winogrand was very fortunate to be championed by John Cherkovsky, the head of the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art. Cherkovsky included Winogrand in 4 separate exhibitions between 1963 and 1977, and the last 2 were solo shows. The 1967 exhibition, a group show with Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, and Deanne Arbus, was called New Documents. And it was Cherkovsky's statement on a new generation of documentary photographers doing a new kind of recording with the camera. Unlike the social documentarians of previous decades, Cherkovsky argued, these 3, quote, redirected the technique and aesthetic of documentary photography to more personal ends. Their aim has not been to reform life, but to know it, not to persuade, but to understand. Winogrand was a new kind of photographer who not only documented the world for personal ends, but also seemed to possess a singular, specialized kind of camera vision. He would often shoot many rolls of film on the way to the place that he was going to photograph. When he died, he did leave hundreds of rolls of undeveloped film and unprinted negatives. When students would ask him why he took pictures, he would say simply, but maybe a little dismissively, I photograph to find out what something will look like photographed. Winogrand popularized the notion of the street photographer equipped with quick reflexes who embraces the chaotic and the contingent to produce split-second compositions such as this one. And as if to prove that the seeing is what makes the picture, Winogrand and many other artists of his day refused to crop the image, showing the edges of the negative in black as a kind of proof of camera vision purity. Now, in the early 1960s, he spent a lot of time at the zoos of New York, the Bronx and Central Park zoos, and the Coney Island Aquarium. And he found there a rich subject matter in the way that humans and animals mimicked each other, whether consciously or not. And he had been showing these prints to Cherkovsky, and the curator proposed an exhibition called The Animals. And this was Winogrand's first solo show. It opened at the Museum of Modern Art in 1969. For the cover of the accompanying monograph, which was also Winogrand's first, Cherkovsky selected this image of an elephant trunk greeting an outstretched hand. So not only do you have the imprimatur of an important curator and institution, but you also have the cover photograph of a book, which would help cement through its apparent importance, somebody chose this to be on the cover, and its repetition across numerous copies, its status as an iconic image. So this image has the benefit of clarity and humor. Animal and human meet each other in a moment of communion and communication, each figure the mirror of the other. Their faces and bodies are off stage, if you will, with just the arm and the trunk reaching across the frame. And it's certainly a compelling cover image. You could imagine yourself seeing it from across the room in a bookstore. But it also offers a little mystery. But one wonders if Tsarkovsky didn't have another such connection in mind. If you've been looking at this and wondering why it seems familiar to you, this may be why. Winogrand, however, flatly denied any similarity of his photograph to Michelangelo's famous image of Adam touching the hand of God, and in a later interview, he irreverently swatted away the suggestion, saying, "It's just that I carry an arm around with me. I wouldn't be caught dead without the arm." There are many more examples I could discuss. Walker Evans' photograph of an Alabama tenant farmer's wife, made, I can hear the voices that you all know these and love these, made on a 1936 trip south with James Agee and published in 1941 in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and highlighting what Evans came to call documentary style. So not a document, but something that was in the style of a document. Robert Frank's photographs from his road trip across the country in the 1950s, in which he revealed that that underneath the surface of American conformity, trouble was brewing. And by making a legendary book of photographs called The Americans, which was savaged by critics at the time, he unwittingly made his photographs into icons, which he then fought against for the rest of his career. Margaret Bourke-White's photograph of Fort Peck Dam in Montana, which graced the cover of the first issue of Life magazine, and displayed her canny skill in both relaying the scale of a massive New Deal project and producing a graphic image with cover appeal. We could have a nice little debate here over which images have proven to be the most influential or enduring, but it's only asked to speak for an hour, and I understand some of you might want to eat dinner soon. So let's recap a bit. With these examples, I wanted to show you a few landmark images in the history of art photography, but not just discuss how they were made, but rather how they came to be icons, how they were received, circulated, promoted. And we've seen a few different pathways for how this happened. So at the level of the image itself, we've seen allusions to other images in the collective consciousness, from a long history of painting and religious iconography to more topical, popular sources. We've seen new definitions for photographic form, for a new photographic vocabulary, if you will, that emerges along with the straight photography movement and a desire on the part of both makers and critics to define what is distinctive about photography as compared to other media. We've seen words attach themselves to images, personal narratives about a work in the case of Stieglitz, say, or manifestos about a movement with Group F64. Sometimes these narratives take decades to take hold, and then they are repeated in critical assessments and scholarly books until they take on the appearance of fact. And importantly, we've seen that as much as modernist photographers and theorists promote a notion of a work of art that is autonomous and independent, that will be recognized apart from and rise above its social or material circumstances, that it is precisely those circumstances that have helped make certain photographs iconic. New figures of cultural authority in the middle of the 20th century, publishers, curators, editors, formed a critical apparatus that cannot be separated from the images themselves. These works that we may think of as timeless as the Mona Lisa are in fact entirely formed by their time. Now today, amidst the barrage of images, videos, GIFs, and emoji that fill our digital landscape, a single photograph can still have the power to cut through the noise. And many of you probably remember this news photograph of the tragic scene of a Salvadoran father and daughter who drowned trying to cross the Rio Grande. This photograph was as much a moral outrage in 2019 as Dorothea Lange's migrant mother was in 1936. But today, many photographic artists are less interested in producing the single iconic image. For several decades now, artists and critics have called into question notions of the original, the genius, the icon. They argue that images are always contingent, never autonomous. Photographs are displayed connected to other images, objects, texts, as Wolfgang Tillmans often does with installations of images from different sources, designed to highlight the relationships among photographs as much as the images themselves. For some, the sheer number of images available to us online becomes subject matter, such as when Eric Kessels in 2013 printed out all the photographs that had been uploaded to Flickr in a 24-hour period, and that number would of course be much, much higher today. For others, such as Penelope Umbrico, online repositories serve as a reminder that convention has overtaken the original idea. My sunset is the same as everybody else's in the world. So when we look at this formation of a photographic canon, we can be grateful that artists and tastemakers have agreed upon a set of images that define accomplishments in art photography. If nothing else, it provides something to fight against. Formulating a canon sparks new questions about how to expand it, who the gatekeepers are, and how to expand those as well, how to bring new voices into the mix of artists and critics. Agreeing upon a canon now also frees us up to ask the more interesting questions of photography, not only about photography's key works of art, but also about power relations, circulation, representation, or truth. Still, this is for you guys. You know that photography has arrived at the level of icon when it too gets the kind of parodies that the Mona Lisa has received. So I'm going to end here for you with this famous photograph by Wichita native son Eugene Smith. And it's Lego homage. Thank you. We're going to take a few questions if there are some.
Any questions?
I am happy to wait.
I was captivated and deeply moved by some of these things. A good friend of mine was a friend of Gordon Clark's. His name's Charlie McAfee. He was an architect, and Gordon came to visit him quite frequently. And there's something about people who really know what they're doing. You know, we all take pictures. You know, it's selfies and so on and so forth. But once in a while, you'll find something that absolutely stuns you, and you just can't let go of it. And the pictures of the people from the Depression. I mean, it was a little boring during those times, but I remember a lot of that stuff. I think you did a beautiful job. It's not a question, it's a statement.
Thank you. I'll tell my parents. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think about people living through their cameras, their cell phone cameras? Everywhere one goes to experience a beautiful sight or an event, people aren't looking at it with their eyes. They're framing it all with their cameras.
Right.
It's like we're seeing.
Can you all hear this in the back? sort of a comment about how our lives are increasingly mediated through the cell phone interface, through the camera. And I don't have much to say except that I wish people would put their cameras down. I think it is the secret weapon of museums, that in this hyper-mediated world, museums can offer an unmediated direct experience. And so, so when people worry about the fate of museums, I think we have something very special here.
Right on.
Yes.
You talk about the intent of the movement of different photographers, and I was wondering where you place Henri Cartier-Bresson. He's probably one of my favorites.
Yeah.
And where you put him in his magical...
The decisive moment.
Right, exactly.
So the question was about Henri Cartier-Bresson and where would I place him. He's definitely in there. There's so many photographers who are not in this talk who are in the canon, I suppose. His book, The Decisive Moment, really articulated a kind of approach to photography that is really the kind of photography that Garry Winogrand takes up later, these quick reflexes and seeing something almost reacting instinctively to it. But then he went on to this great career at Magnum, which is a photo agency and collective that he co-founded with photographers going all around the world, documenting the important things of our day. And then the collective part of it was that they maintained control of their images. That was very important to Cartier-Bresson. Yes?
Seems like one thing that a lot of these iconic photos have in common is the ability to stir our emotion and to evoke from within us a very strong emotional response.
Even out of a pepper.
Yeah, even out of bell pepper. And I guess I wasn't sure what time frame you were going to be talking about, but thinking on into more my contemporary, so like Vietnam, the My Lai.
Right.
Like 9/11.
Right.
The flag with the rubble still smoking.
Right. So the question was sort of about how photographs really affect our emotions, and the kinds of photographs that you're talking about, Vietnam and 9/11, are mostly news photographs. So the kinds of photographs that I talked about in the beginning that are significant to us because of what they're depicting, a famous event or a famous person.
Something
And
like Iwo Jima.
Right, I mean, we could, right, exactly. We could go on. And these are photographs that are compelling for a number of reasons, for the fact of the event itself, for the incredible ability of a photographer to distill that into some message, for the use of symbolism like the American flag. But what I really wanted to get at more was, how does a pepper become emotional? How does, some guy's boater hat? So how is a new definition of photography just in and of itself, not showing us something about the world that we already would be emotional about? How does that happen?
Are you a photographer?
I'm a failed photographer.
So we should have shown us one picture at least.
Yes.
Who should we be watching for? Who's coming up?
Oh boy. So I live very comfortably, mostly in the 19th century, and those people are all dead, I'm afraid. I can tell you right now that our museum and our department is putting a big focus on Africa. There's a lot of talent there, and I have wonderful colleagues who are doing wonderful work there.
How do you search for the non-icon?
I guess the way you would search for anything else, books and the internet. I mean, if there's a particular artist that you just admire, I would try to follow them. And if there's a subject matter you're particularly interested, that's a good way to go. The non-iconic is a very large quantity of images. Yes.
I have a weird question. I do a lot of street photography,
but I'm not happy with that term, and I'm wondering if anyone has come up with a better term.
Right. Street photography is almost a historical term now, I'd say, that, at least to me, really evokes pictures made around the 60s and 70s. And I don't know if anybody else has a better term yet, so maybe we can huddle after this and brainstorm a little bit. Okay, 1 and then 2. You're 1.
Okay, I'm 1. Okay. I just have you had Migrant Mother,
Mm-hmm.
and then the image of the 2 people drowned.
Yeah.
I have Migrant Mother hanging in my house. Will I ever have the 2 people drowned hanging in my house?
I don't know what your house is like, but I would suggest.
What I'm saying is, I mean,
they're different kinds of photographs. They really are. So, I mean, maybe the comparison is not Migrant Mother and the 2 people drowned, but the My Lai massacre, or or something. Migrant Mother doesn't directly depict violence. It depicts people suffering in the midst of violence.
sad.
It is, and it also might hint at perseverance and survival, all sorts of other things. And I also think it's easier to look at disaster with time. I think it, the distance from something makes it somewhat historical and not as personally relevant, I guess.
That young man is a fine photographer.
So, thank you. There was, yeah.
So, kind of picking on Kurt's comment, where the first color photo that you showed was that picture that he discussed. And I wondered if you would talk about color ever. I mean, so many of these pictures are black and white. It's a question that so many people ask photographers.
Right.
Why do you shoot color or black? But I'm just curious, in your scholarship, how has color or not come up with icon?
It's such a good question. So this particular talk was a little bit historically based in the middle of the 20th century, and you definitely could do color then. But color was thought by many people to be the province of commercial photography and advertising photography. That said, you've got Elliot Porter, you've got Irving Penn's making some color work, even Harry Callahan's making some color work then. So there are people working in color for sure. It's not really until Eggleston at MoMA and Eggleston's guide that color photography starts to take hold as pervasively on the art landscape.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. One last round of applause.
Thanks, everybody.